Well, the Liberals have claimed another term in Tasmania, but it's come at a cost. The party has fallen short of securing a majority, meaning it will need to negotiate with the crossbench to get its policies through the parliament or even hold on to power in the first place. Confidence and supply. It seems that Tasmanians who swung away from the Liberals didn't actually give their vote directly to Labor. So what message are voters setting to the major parties here? Joining me now from Redbridge Group is Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, great to see you. We've talked about this a lot, and here is another real-life example. The major parties and their base is shrinking. More and more people are going to the crossbench.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yes, it is another data point in the trend, and the trend is not the friend of the major parties. So again, what we've seen is where those major parties lose big chunks of votes, as indeed the Liberals did on their primary vote in Tasmania, that doesn't necessarily land on Labor in this particular instance. And we've seen the reverse where Labor's lost votes. It doesn't necessarily land on the Liberals. But I think one of the fascinating things coming out of the Tasmanian election is, with implications wider than just Tasmania, is that the Greens didn't pick up a fair bit of that vote. Now, you would expect the types of voters that we're seeing come off the Liberal piles, it sort of may sound sort of counterintuitive, but the types of voters that are coming off that Liberal pile, which is traditionally your wet Lib, university-educated Lib, often land on the Greens. And we saw in Tasmania sort of that there wasn't much change there. I think they went up about 1%, same as Labor went up about 1%, but the rest of it scattered to a whole host of minor parties. And the Jacqui Lambie Network did particularly well. But we think there's something going on in the Green vote, and we think this Tasmanian example kind of points to it, which is we think what's happening is that there's a bit of an inflow-outflow problem on the Green vote, which is they don't seem to have too much problem bringing in younger voters to sort of boost their base, but they've got a problem with older progressive voters at the other end, sort of coming off their base. And we think what's happening there is we're not seeing people age into conservative voting, in the way that previous generations certainly have. As people get older, they tend to vote a bit more conservative as they accumulate wealth and those sorts of things. And we've talked about how that sort of wealth accumulation isn't happening, so that sort of influences the political vote. But what generally happens is, particularly when they start having kids, is these progressive voters become a bit more, we call them sort of pragmatic progressives, which is they start to sort of look for an expression of their progressive values in things like education policy, in things like public transport policy, even in things like infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes a progressive issue, becomes about economic opportunity, as well as things like climate and those sorts of things. And we think what's happening is it's that older, pragmatic, progressive vote seems to be sort of the outflow that's offsetting what the Greens are getting on the inflow. So we suspect they'll continue to do quite well where there's a low median voter age sort of electorates, but it's that older group of progressives that we think is sort of balancing that out at the moment. So we're seeing a bit of sort of stasis in the Green vote.
Okay, that's really interesting, because how does this translate nationwide, do you like? Because the Greens party is no longer a protest party, really, are they? I mean, people used to park their vote there when they were upset with both the major parties. It's a little bit more than that. You can see that, around Queensland, particularly around Brisbane at the last election. But as you say, there's that inflow, outflow. Is the benefit there, or the beneficiaries there, other independents like Daly, perhaps the Teals?
Yeah, and I think you sort of put your finger on it there. I think part of the problem is that these pragmatic progressives that we're talking about don't want a protest party. And there's still a bit of I think these voters would say too much of a flavour of that in the Greens. And certainly where it's flowing, it seems to be flowing to, other independents, those sorts of things, but to Labor. And it's offsetting losses that Labor's experiencing to Lib. So there's a bit of sort of shuffling around going around here with some things that maybe look like they're stable. When you actually sort of dig beneath the surface, there's actually sort of inflows and outflows going on.
Okay, so how worried should the major parties be, Simon, given we've got the Queensland election later this year, Northern Territory a little bit before that, and then eventually a federal election will roll around?
I think, this is a structural change that we're seeing in the Australian vote at the moment. We're going through this transition period where it's been a two-party model for many, many years. The lack of trust. So it's what's driving these factors, which is the important thing. It's not disenchantment with a particular government, although I think in Queensland we'll see a bit of that, which might actually sort of buck the trend a little bit. And I think we will see some direct Labor to Liberal transference in that because of dissatisfaction with that particular government. But if you look at the broader trend, it's not about a particular government. It's about a fundamental distrust of the major parties. It's about people feel like that they see them to blame for the economic and social hurts in their lives. But it's also, I think that there's also a sort of a communication aspect to this. It's becoming far more complicated to reach voters. And I don't think the major parties have yet sort of really cracked that nut of how do you reach the very voters that we're talking about here that are sort of disenchanted, disengaging, and no longer sort of want to buy into that two-party distinction and are looking for something else.
Well, I can almost hear the groan coming from the major party headquarters this morning at this conversation, Simon, and they do watch every week, I can tell you that. a bit depressing for them this morning, but perhaps a little bit of a lightning rod. Who knows? Maybe they'll pull up their socks. Simon, great to talk to you. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Laura.